It turns out controlling your shard in the Cosmere and making sure its intent doesn't consume you is a skill issue. Now, at this point in time in the Cosmere, we have seen enough of the different shards and their vessels and how they've interacted with each other, and how a vessel can manipulate and maneuver its shard and the shard's intent to their own goals. We've also seen how detrimental this can be to the vessel themselves. Now, the worst case scenario that we have seen in all of the Cosmere is what happened with Ruin. Ati was eventually completely overtaken by the intent of Ruin, and he basically became a completely different person. Now, through Hoid, we know that Ati was one of the kindest and most gentlest of all the people who took up a shard. In fact, we're pretty sure that's why he was given Ruin, because they wanted him to be able to keep the power in line. And he wasn't completely unsuccessful. Ruin just wanted to destroy everything. And Ati was able to take Ruin's intent and steer it into more of a way of entropy instead of just pure destruction. That the decay of the world around them and death was the inevitable choice for everything, not just that they all needed to be blown up and destroyed. But at the same time, he still completely failed. He was not able to control his shard, and as we see in Mistborn Era 1, he was completely turned into a monster. Everything for him was destruction. He just wanted the entire planet gone because that's what he was promised. And I'm sure that if he succeeded there, he would have gone and rampaged throughout the Cosmere. Maybe not coming into complete conflict with all the other shards, but he could have gone around the Cosmere just snuffing out planets wherever he wanted. Now, the vessel controlling Preservation didn't actually do that much better. Leras was more competent and better at future sight than Ati was when controlling Ruin. He was able to look into the future, and he was able to steer the world into a way in which that he could stop Ruin. Now, it did cost him his life, but this does show that he was more skilled at maneuvering his shard than Ati was. Ati was just consumed, while Leras was able to manipulate a bunch of different stuff, even though it kind of contradicted his shard and what his shard wanted to then go ahead and stop Ruin. At the same time, he was basically made impotent by his shard. Tanavast described Leras as a strong-willed individual, but when we see him in Mistborn Era 1, he is just a fraction of himself, and he really can't harm or do anything because it would change something. And his shard had overpowered him so much that him causing any change was crippling to who he was. Now, maybe if he hadn't bound Ruin and basically killed himself in the past, he would have been able to do more, but that seems very unlikely. He basically left an image of himself and his personality, and it seems like all it did was just turn him into someone who could watch. Luckily, he was able to set up his plans in advance so that Ruin was defeated. This leads us into Harmony. Now, we don't have enough information about Harmony. We do know that he may be quite skilled because he was able to defeat Autonomy. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, no, Wax defeated Autonomy. Yes, but Wax was created by Harmony, and I think he probably knew more about what was going to happen with Autonomy than he let on. Shards can lie and manipulate, which is something that is very common to them. Shards are commonly viewed as gods, and so a lot of people fall into the trap of thinking that they can only speak truth, and that's just not the case. Either way, once again, we just haven't seen enough with Sazed. We do know that he is being quite negatively affected by the two shards and their conflicting ideologies, even though he's trying to bring them into harmony. This seems to be failing, and it seems very likely that Sazed will become Discord, or at least someone else will pick up the shard and become Discord. Though, based on what we saw in Isles of the Emberdark, it's hard to believe that Sazed loses the power of the shard because of what was said by the Arcanist. Now, if we want to talk to people that seem to be more in line with their shard, and so they're not actually being degraded in the same way that Ruin and Preservation were, we have Honor. Tanavast actually feels like he was somewhat of a good pick for his shard. He didn't really lose or degrade himself as time passed when he was controlling his shard. He was just completely incompetent at controlling his shard. So his personal self didn't actually change, but he completely dropped the ball every chance he had. He proved that he couldn't really use Future Sight all that well. In fact, the only times we really see him use it is at the end of his life, or when he's about to conflict with Odium and he realizes, oh my gosh, we would destroy everything. And frankly, that's not really much of Future Sight. And even when he dies, I don't know how much future sight it was. He just kind of Hail Married it in the end. And frankly, he was kind of mostly manipulated by cultivation every step of the way. This is a man that should have idealized what Honor's intent was, but unfortunately, when he found out that it was more about oaths and less about being honorable, he completely couldn't adjust his way of thinking. He also forced himself onto the shard, and he thought because he was the vessel, he could do whatever he wants, the shard be damned. And that led to him being rejected by the shard and then killed by Odium. Speaking of Odium, he really is somebody that was more competent than Tanavast. In fact, he was actually quite competent at controlling the shard, and he is almost perfectly in line with his shard's intent. He was a very aggressive, hateful, emotional man. And Odium is just pure hatred. Even though he wanted to lie to not only himself but the shard and say it was passion, I don't think that actually worked against him because the shard didn't care as long as he was embodying its intent. And he did perfectly. In fact, he went out and killed multiple shards, which perfectly fit the aggression of Odium's hatred. Though while looking competent in comparison to Honor and maybe Ruin, he still wasn't as good as a lot of the other shards out there. So he ended up being outmaneuvered and was finally killed by Taravangian because of Cultivation's machinations. Cultivation was able to completely set Rayse up to be destroyed, and I think her plans went all the way back to when Rayse and Honor came back to Roshar after destroying the humans' home planet on Braze. This all sets up Taravangian to pick up Odium, and eventually for Dalinar to pick up Honor and let it go so that Taravangian can pick up both and become Retribution. Now, it seems like Taravangian is perfectly primed to be Retribution. I actually think that was Cultivation's plan from the beginning, and if you want to hear more about that, I have another video about how Cultivation created Retribution on purpose. So I'm not going to get too much into that here. Either way, we don't have enough time with Taravangian being Odium or Retribution to really get into how it's affecting him. We do see a little bit when he's Odium about him coming to decisions based off of his intellectual side and his emotional sides, but it still doesn't seem to wear him down, and he is outplayed at the end by Dalinar or Cultivation. But once again, I won't get into that. Either way, he's outplayed, and now he's stuck on Roshar still. Now, you'd think I would go straight into Cultivation here, but I want to take a little bit of a side path and go to Autonomy and Bavadin, who controls it. Bavadin, to me, doesn't feel like she actually completely embodies Autonomy, but I think that she might be the most skilled at manipulating her shard. I'm not going to get too much into why I don't think Bavadin perfectly embodies Autonomy, because I already once again have a video about that, which you can go and watch. But that is completely besides the point, because she is obviously really good at directing her shard. She is all over the place creating religions and creating new avatars of herself for other people to control and for her to manipulate. Yet, even with all of that skill, she still ends up being defeated by Harmony on Scadrial. Now, I'm going to move on to Cultivation and her vessel, Koravellium Avast, who from here on out, I'm going to refer to as Kora. As far as I'm concerned, Cultivation both shows that she is perfectly in line with her shard's intent and is one of the best at controlling that shard. She also seems to be the best at interacting and beating other shards. Now, some people are going to point out that Taravangian beats her. You're just wrong. Taravangian was set up by Cultivation to become Retribution, and she controlled every single second of it, and we're going to find that out in Stormlight Era 2. I 100% believe that with everything I am. We know that Kora is perfectly in line with Cultivation's intent because of how she uses it throughout the millennia on Roshar. In fact, we see two very good examples of this in Stormlight Era 1. Dalinar and Taravangian are perfectly manipulated by Cultivation and prepared to become shards on their own. And she doesn't just achieve this by turning them into any specific thing. No, she likes to prune and change things about a person in order to give them the ability to grow and become better. She prunes Dalinar of his memories of his wife only to give them back when he needed them the most in order to overcome a challenge in his life. She also cultivated Taravangian by splitting him into two personalities. That way, he would be the perfect vessel for picking up Odium and eventually Honor. At the end of the day, picking up a shard might be the easiest part about being a shard holder. Yes, I know it's not an easy task, but when you consider that you have to then spend thousands of years, more likely than not, trying to control that shard's power without it overwhelming you, it seems extremely daunting. Now, I'm sure many people in the Cosmere would love the chance to experiment with that, but I'm also sure many of those people would probably be the first to be destroyed by their shard. I also know that I didn't talk about every single shard in this video. That's because we didn't get much about the other vessels and how they're interacting with their respective shards. For all I know, they're complete messes, completely taken over, or some of them might be even better than Cultivation and Autonomy at manipulating their shard. The only thing I do know is that one of them splintered themselves, and 3 of them at this point have been splintered by others, which has caused many complications throughout the Cosmere, but doesn't give you any sign about how they interacted with their shards.